All right, AP US History students, we are going to talk about the constitutional period in US history. So we've made it up to the end of the Revolutionary War, and now we're going to pick up with the beginnings of our new nation. This period is also commonly referred to as the Federalist era. All right, so as you go through this series of notes, think about to what extent was the American Revolution considered a turning point in American politics and society. So it's going to be revolutionary in some ways and not so revolutionary in others, particularly social areas. To what extent did the ratification or approval of the Constitution maintain a continuity and foster change in American politics and society? Okay, so as the end of the Revolutionary War, or the Revolutionary War comes to an end, we are faced with forming a new government. So in 1777, the Articles of Confederation are adopted and they become the law of the land. But we also have a question about sharing power between states and federal government. So states drafted new constitutions, which are going to clearly define citizen rights. They tended to be conservative with bicameral legislatures and strong governors. They almost all required property ownership in order to be qualified to vote. So you had to be both male and a property owner. Examples of these conservative state constitutions existed in Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. Liberal state constitutions tended to have unicameral legislatures and weak governors. So the governor is going to be the executive of the state. Universal manhood suffrage, meaning that the only requirement to vote would be that you were free and that you were male. And these are going to exist in New Jersey and New Hampshire. The other question is it going to be a Republican form of government? And by Republican, I mean not the Republican Party so much, but electing representatives to represent you in Congress versus a democracy. Republicanism is typically preferred by the elites of a society because it places power in the hands of a few who are tasked with acting for the common good. Democracy tends to be synonymous with mob rule and development of factions and corruption and sometimes a limitation on individual liberty. So there is also a lot of debate within this question of republicanism versus democracy of who is going to be able to vote in a democracy. Whites, property owners, all males, women's, Christians, etc. So as I mentioned before, in 1777, prior to the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States adopts the Articles of Confederation as its form of government. So the Declaration of Independence does not create any government at all. The only thing the Declaration of Independence does is declare our independence. It just states that we are formally separating from England. It does not in any way, shape, or form create our government. The document that does that is the Articles of Confederation. So under the Articles of Confederation, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. There is a unicameral legislature, meaning there is a single house legislature, and the central or national government is incredibly weak under the Articles of Confederation. The national government has no executive branch. It has no judicial branch. It could not regulate interstate commerce, which is a fancy way of saying business between the states, and it had limited abilities to tax. In fact, I would describe it as the national government under the Articles of Confederation could not force the states to pay taxes to the national government. They could request money, but often those requests were denied. Voting in the legislature under the Articles of Confederation, each state received one vote, although they may have sent anywhere between 4 and 7 representatives. They still only had one vote, and no new tax or amendments could be passed under the Articles of Confederation without unanimous consent of all 13 states. Now, there are some good things that come out of the Articles of Confederation. There are some bad things that come out of the Articles of Confederation, and there are some very ugly things that come out of the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to start with the good. So one of the things that we gain as a result of the Treaty of 1783 is massive amounts of land. So this right here represents the original 13 states, and then all of this land right to this line right here, and I'm pointing this out for a reason. Actually, it's this line right here. This is the disputed territory. So all of this land right to here is what we gain as a result of the Treaty of 1783. So the first thing that states do is they start claiming this land. So Massachusetts claims all of this land. Connecticut claims all of this land. We have Virginia claiming a bunch of land. We have the Carolinas claiming a bunch of land. Georgia claims a bunch of land. And so we have this sort of free-for-all land grab. And in order to deal with this and distribute land more fairly, the national government, under the Articles of Confederation, passes the Land Ordinance of 1785. And what it does is it requires first that states give back or cede the land to the national government. This Northwest Territory, and all of this land is considered Northwest Territory at this point, is then going to be developed into 36 square mile townships. So each township divided into 36 sections of 640 acres each, and the acres would be sold for $1 a piece. Now, the land is sold in an effort to raise money for the federal government. Each 36 square mile township has a section set aside for school and for church, and some land is set aside as a source of federal revenue. Following the Land Ordinance of 1785, we have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It is going to forbid slavery north of the Ohio River, and its primary purpose is to come up with a orderly policy on how to admit states, how a territory will be able to apply to become a state that will exist on the same footing as any of the pre-existing states. So to become a state, they would appoint territorial officials. Once the population of adult males reached 5,000 people, they could then vote on a temporary constitution and legislature, which would be in place until 60,000 residents lived in the area, and then they could formally approve a state constitution and become a state. Of course, this giant land grab is going to anger natives. They're going to reach out to the British for support and make deals with the Spanish. So this area right here, it belongs to the United States. Britain still controls much of Canada, and there's going to be some dispute here with Britain over land. And then we are going to dispute this with Spain. We're going to make some deals before it becomes a part of the United States. So the problems with the Articles of Confederation, or the weaknesses, is that regardless of the size of the state, and when I say size, I mean population, each state only had one vote. Congress is powerless to lay or collect taxes or duties. They could request taxes or duties, but the states had the right of refusal. Congress could not regulate foreign trade or interstate commerce. There was no executive to enforce the laws of Congress. So Congress can make laws all day long, but if there's nobody to enforce those laws, then the laws are meaningless. There's no national court system to define constitutionality or deal with internal disputes. An amendment to the Articles of Confederation was almost impossible to get because you had to have a unanimous consent. And you required a nine states out of the 13 majority in order to pass laws. And the articles are really only a firm league of friendship. So at this time, so you can't think of the United States at this time as being truly the United States we think of today. We were not united. We probably resembled much more what you see in Europe, in that we were allied for some common purposes. But if you met someone during the time, they were much more likely to describe themselves by the state that they lived in than the country they lived in. So that if you met someone from Virginia, they were much more likely to say, I'm a Virginian, as opposed to I'm an American. The ugly part of the Articles of Confederation is really highlighted as a result of Shays' Rebellion. So tensions are rising during this time period, essentially because people are unable to pay their taxes, and they are, and as a result, their farms and homes are being foreclosed on. So Daniel Shays is a Massachusetts farmer in serious debt. He is holding and participating in meetings that are referring to the Massachusetts government as tyrannical. And if you remember, under the Declaration of Independence, a tyrannical government can be rebelled against and overthrown. So that use of that word tyrannical, I think, is really important. And Daniel Shays does, in fact, instigate a rebellion, leading 2,000 men to shut down Western courts to avoid or stop the foreclosures on these farms. And what we have virtually is civil war in Massachusetts. And because the national government under the Articles of Confederation is very weak, they cannot muster an army to go put down the rebellion. So the ultimate effect of this is that the Articles of Confederation are proven essentially to be useless as a result of Shays' rebellion. And so at this time, either, we're at a crossroads. We're either going to get delegates together to talk about how do we fix the problem, or we are facing potential dissolution or devolution. And what they choose to do is hold a convention in Annapolis, Maryland. It's called the Annapolis Convention, in which they initially talk about what do we do with the Articles of Confederation. But the real sentiment that's growing amongst some members of the elite is that we need to get rid of the Articles of Confederation altogether and go with a brand new governing document, which will be the Constitution. So as we move towards a constitution, the timeline goes a little something like this. We have the Annapolis Convention in 1786. So it's after a meeting run by Washington. Delegates from 5 states meet in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss, how do we deal with some of the problems of interstate commerce and debt and that sort of thing. And they decide to reform the Articles with other delegates. And so they meet at a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. So all states attend but Rhode Island. Rhode Island is just super, super sassy. This meeting is held in secret. And it's held in secret to keep any hysteria or keep newspaper bias, any wild rumors that might come out. By keeping it secret, they're able to do the work that they need to do without the intervention of public. Everyone who attends, by and large, has a common nationalist viewpoint. And the question they initially debate is, do we reform the Articles or do we devise a new government altogether? They don't debate this too terribly long. So the delegates, there were 55 total delegates, and here's the shocker, they were all white males. More shocker, they were wealthy, middle-aged, professional, a lot of lawyers and politicians. 19 of the delegates owned slaves, and this is going to be one of the issues that comes up during the Constitutional Convention. And some of the delegates that owned slaves were very much against the idea of not counting slaves towards population and what do we do about the slave trade, but we'll get to that in a minute. Some of the delegates include George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin. The first thing they deal with is the issue of representation. And you have two really basic ideas. The large states, or states with large population, wanted representation to be determined by population. And this is known as the Big State Plan or the Virginia Plan. Under the Virginia Plan, they wanted a strong central government. They wanted virtually total legislative control over the states. They wanted a bicameral or 2-house legislature with proportional representation to each state's population in both houses. The lower house is directly elected by the public. The lower house then elected the upper house with input from state legislatures, and both houses chose the executive and the judicial branch. Under the New Jersey plan, which I want you to think of as the small state plan, they wanted a unicameral legislature, each state with an equal vote, and proposes executive and judicial branches. So a guy from Connecticut decides that he is going to propose the Great Compromise. So sometimes this is called the Connecticut Compromise. Sometimes it's called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is a blending of the two proposal, so blending the Virginia plan with the New Jersey plan. And so what we get when we blend the New Jersey plan, which is the small state plan, with the Virginia plan, which is the big state plan, we get a bicameral legislature. So we get two houses in Congress. We get the House of Representatives and the Senate. The lower house is going to satisfy the desire of the big states to have proportional representation based on population, who are directdirectly elected. The upper house, which is the Senate, will have equal representation of 2 senators per state. And initially, the senators are going to be elected by state legislators. That isn't the case anymore. The Virginia and New Jersey plans allowed for Congress to pass revenue bills, meaning they can levy taxes, they can regulate commerce, and that the central government or the federal government is going to be supreme or more powerful and control the state. So for the supremacy clause that's in the Constitution essentially states that whenever there's a conflict between a national law and a state law, the national law is going to take precedence. The structure of the national government under the Constitution gives us a separation of powers. So if you remember when we were talked about the Enlightenment, we talked about Baron de Montesquieu. And if you remember, Montesquieu has 3 syllables, and he proposes 3 branches of government, which is exactly what we have. Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch, including the House of Representatives and the Senate. Article 2 establishes the executive branch, including the presidency, vice presidency, and the agencies. And Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. Now, Article 3 only establishes the Supreme Court. It does not establish any of the lower courts. That's going to come later. The Constitution also gives us checks and balances. So, for example, if the president isn't satisfied with a bill passed by Congress, he can veto it. If Congress wants to override that veto, they can do that with a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate. The Constitution also includes the concept of federalism, which is sharing responsibilities, governing responsibilities between national and state governments. So there are some government behaviors that are done only by the national government. There are some behaviors that are only done by the states, and then there are some that are shared. So the Constitutional Convention desires to create a stronger national government that will directly address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So the initial and one of the biggest problems of the Article of Confederation is there was no power to tax. The constitutional solution to that is that the Constitution and the federal government can levy or lay and collect taxes. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no power to regulate interstate commerce or foreign trade. Under the Constitution, they can regulate interstate and foreign commerce with no export taxes. There is no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution remedies that with a president who is elected by the Electoral College and serves a 4-year term. There is no judicial branch under the Articles of Confederation. To remedy that, we have the U.S. Supreme Court. Amendments under the Articles of Confederation required that every single state unanimously consent to the amendment. Amendments in the Constitution require that it is approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures. So just a bit of trivia, there have been 11,000 attempts to amend our current Constitution, and we only have been successful at amending it 27 times. I think that's pretty interesting. You needed a super majority to pass laws, meaning that you needed more than 51%. A simple majority means that you just need 51% of a group to be the majority to pass. A supermajority means that you need much more than that. The presentment clause means that you only need a simple majority by both houses to pass a law. Another issue that comes up at the Constitution, if you remember, I told you that there were delegates at the Constitutional Convention that owned slaves, is what do we do about slavery in the new Constitution? So slavery is going to become an issue, particularly as it comes to counting your population. So under the Great Compromise, states were awarded representation in the House of Representatives that was proportional to their population. And in order to gain more power in the House of Representatives, the southern states requested slave populations be counted so that they could gain more representation in Congress. The majority of the U.S. population lived in the North. Excuse me. And to balance out this potential power differential, the southern states requested that their slaves be counted toward their population. The northern states noted the hypocrisy of this because while the slaves might be counted toward this population, they were not granted any of the civil rights that a regular citizen would have. There was also an issue of taxation, how taxation would be applied in the situation. What they ultimately come to is what is known as the 3/5 compromise, and this is directly written into the Constitution, and it is what is often pointed to in terms of noting the imperfections in the document. So each slave counted as 3/5 of a person, so that when the slave population was counted, 3 of every 5 slaves would count toward a southern state's population in terms of representation in Congress. It also includes a fugitive slave clause, and it bans the importation of slaves from Africa by 1808. And essentially what we see here is that the founding fathers understand that the issue of slavery is a contentious one and one that needs to be addressed, but ultimately what they do is kick the can down the road by about 20 years. So the Constitutional Convention, when this happens, they give it about 20 years to end the importation of slaves in 1808. Ratification becomes a thing, and two groups emerge. There are people who support the Constitution, and there are people who are against the Constitution. The people who support the Constitution are known as Federalists. Federalists support a strong central government. They believe that the strong central government will act for the common good and in the common good of the population. The Federalists are well funded, they are well politically organized, and the Federalists are supported by the merchants and the urbanites found primarily in the North. Notable Federalists are Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Now, James Madison being in this group is actually pretty interesting because he's later going to switch sides when he after the Constitution is ratified, but I just want to point that out. In order to gain support for the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay write a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers. There are 85 Federalist Papers. The majority of them are written by Alexander Hamilton, followed by James Madison, with I think maybe 5 written by John Jay. The two most important ones are Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51. Federalist number 10 deals with factions, or how a strong central government will help control the influences of factions. So factions I would align today with special interest groups or with political parties. Federalist number 10 or Federalist number 51 deals with the concept that men are not angels and men need to be governed, and so we need a strong government and a strong executive to govern mankind. All of the Federalist Papers are arguing for a strong central government. They're arguing the value of the central government. Now, the Federalist Papers are primarily written to convince the citizens of New York, the state of New York, to ratify the Constitution, although they are going to be used in other places. The anti-federalists are against this new Constitution. They argue that states' rights are going to be limited by this Constitution, and they say because the Constitution does not contain a Bill of Rights, which explicitly spells out rights that every citizen should have, there is potential for the Constitution or for people who run the federal government to limit individual liberties. The anti-federalist position tended to be favored by small farmers and Western homesteaders, so primarily people who are in agricultural industry. Famous Anti-Federalists include George Mason, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, are also very famous Anti-Federalists, and they speak out against the federal government. Mostly because they fear that the federal government under the Constitution will become too strong, and then it will abuse individual liberties just like King George III did, and they just fought a war to get out from under that. So Patrick Henry, in a speech before the Virginia ratifying convention, argues that the Constitution needs a Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist number 84, argues that it does not need a Bill of Rights, that all human rights are accounted for, and that by creating a list, you may limit other rights. But one of the main arguments between Federalists and Anti-Federalists comes down to the Bill of Rights. So the delegates of the Constitutional Convention really do want unanimous consent to the Constitution. They don't want to give the appearance to any foreign government that there is discontent or a place where a foreign government might drive a wedge between states under the new government. So once the Constitution is ratified, meaning 9 of the 13 states have approved it, the argument to ratify the Constitution still continues in an effort to make sure that it is unanimous. So when New Hampshire ratifies the Constitution in 1788, the Constitution becomes the law of the land. After the Constitution is ratified, the Bill of Rights is added to satisfy the Anti-Federalists. So as you can see here, ratified on the date that New Hampshire certifies. The Bill of Rights is made up of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So the first amendment includes the Establishment Clause, which means that there will not be a state religion. The Free Exercise Clause, you may practice your religion any way you choose. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. Fifth Amendment allows due process. The Sixth Amendment allows for speedy and fair trial and right to counsel, and particularly in criminal hearings. And the 10th Amendment says that any rights, any powers that are not specifically given to the federal government in the Constitution reserves the remaining powers for the states. So in Article 10, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution and not prohibited by the Constitution to the states or reserved for the states respectively or to the people. So Article 10 is the here you go to the Anti-Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists get their Bill of Rights, and we get unanimous ratification of the Constitution. All right, so I would like for you to pause and read this historiography, and we're actually going to pause here, and we will talk about the presidency of Washington and Adams in a later video.